Reframing and reforming congregational worship, an appeal for a reset. Before I start, there's this tiny little squiggle over there, and that squiggle keeps reappearing in different shapes and forms with different intensity throughout the discussion today. Because I have a feeling that worship is this it's this concept that we sometimes have a really complicated relationship with. It is something that we desire, it is something we know we ought to do, and at the same time, we have these different angles and these different experiences of friction in that category. And I just want to, I guess I had two options of entering this discussion. I could have gone for this kind of like really jolly and optimistic presentation of the ideal, and then would have left perhaps many of you thinking that I am entirely naive. So I wanted to avoid that, and I wanted to also express that what I am presenting to you today is not coming from a point of this pink glassed, I don't even know, like this flower girl type of an experience. It comes from an experience that has had to wrestle with these questions and also with the practical reality of congregational worship for several years. And I understand that there are many of you today in the audience who have a longer history of doing that. But maybe bear with me. I am not entirely uninformed and not entirely inexperienced just yet. I think I've legitimately reached the point where I can call myself middle-aged. So my midlife crisis should be here with that little squiggle today. So I am flagging this squiggle up every time that I feel like there is this potential for the friction. And you can imagine those squiggles anywhere that you feel that they keep popping up for you. Maybe you would already put some squiggles over reframing and reforming as well. Maybe you have a complicated relationship with those terms. Maybe reset triggers something inside of you. Maybe Kärt Lazic triggers something inside of you. So keep imagining those squiggles for yourself and work your way through it through the presentation today. This tiny one over here is a tiny reminder that the squiggles happen in our lives, that the moments where we just go, eek. But as I said, maybe worship occasionally is a category where it doesn't look as small as that. Maybe it's much bigger. And we can see the topic more like this. It's been overtaken with different experiences that we've had. And there's a good reason for that. There's a good reason for this to be a complicated topic. Because it mixes so many different categories that are significant for us. First of all, it's a theological topic. And if you hold a worldview in which God matters, then anything theological also becomes significant, and anything theologically complicated becomes a point where things go into friction, where there's disruption or disturbance. Secondly, worship is something that is personal, and we take it personally. It's supposed to be something that touches us. We come with our own very strong expectations to any of those situations. And the complication there is that it is personal, but congregational worship obviously is not individual, which means that we come together as a community, and whenever 2 or 3 are gathered, it always comes with complications. Yes, there's a spirit. Yes, all of that is true. But it also comes with the realization that these other 2 people next to me are not me. And the moment that we have to start deciding how we do things together, the moment that we have to start getting on the same page, it's not as easy anymore. So the stuff starts going in that way. It's also experiential, which means that it hits harder than just the theory. It hits into our hearts and into our guts. It does also address the brains. It is a holistic experiential thing that is supposed to happen. And because of that, we also feel the impact of the moments when there is this friction. We feel it, perhaps it just comes across a little more raw than just theoretical exercises. It is also something that is very visible. It is a visible part of being together. It is a visible part of doing church. It is a regular part of doing church. It is often a weekly, maybe more times than just once, gathering for many people who subscribe to the Christian worldview. And as such, it is something that is concrete. It is something that is foregrounded in our understanding of what it means to do church, what it means to do spirituality, what it means to do faith. And because it's foregrounded, it also becomes more pronounced, and our opinions about it become somehow spotlit with that foregrounding. Lastly, it is culturally significant. And what I mean culturally significant is that Christian communities have placed a heavy emphasis on the idea of coming together. As I wrote in my little blurb, if you read it, we are always encouraged not to neglect the gatherings, right? It's something that is cited to us. If people don't come to church on Sabbath morning, then we send deacons after them. We send the pastors for visitations. We wonder what happened to them. We don't wonder about them that much on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, but suddenly when they don't show up for congregational worship, then it is a sign of something, a sign of troubles, a sign of theological complications or communal absence. And as a result, because it is culturally significant for us as a community, then it also has become over time ritualized. There are ways that we believe are more right and ways that are less right of doing this coming together. There are elements that need to be there, elements that could never be there. There are all of this wonderful choreography that we have inherited, that we are also ourselves renegotiating, and then that we are also passing on to the next generations. It has become ritualized. Now, all of these things are perfectly fine. All of these things are things that I believe worship should be. I am just listing these elements to highlight what fields come together that make worship so meaningful for us. And because it is meaningful for us, or it should be meaningful, it also is a loaded field. So we are stepping into a space with great potential, but also triggers that are experientially personal, experiences that we can recite and we can go back to, that might be positive, that might be negative, opinions that are strong, well-rooted, that we are passionate about. We have theological debates in our church, but I think that probably the most passionate discussions happen around the question of how do we do worship together? What is permissible? What is encourageable? What is blasphemous in that space? Now, as a result, I would like to remind us all that we need to approach this topic today with empathy. I put that squiggle over there because that squiggle might mean that there are elements inside of us that already start resounding a bit weird within us, but also that as we come to this together as a community, we come with a massive diversity of opinions and experiences and associations of that concept. I also believe that there is good value in being empathetic to ourselves in this discussion, and we are used to. You already mentioned that we need to be civil, we need to be caring in our discussions and kind, but I would like us to also be kind to ourselves at the moment. If you happen to be a part of the group of people whose experiences have led you to be skeptical or even bitter or hurt or scarred or entirely exhausted and indifferent when it comes to the concept of congregational worship, just exercise empathy, exercise grace today. Just be gentle with yourself in this space, and just let yourself sit with this discussion, see what happens at the end of it, hand it over to God. Let's see what the journey does to us. As we approach it, here are some recommended positionings for this entire talk. I would invite us all to be reflective and self-reflective. So notice those squiggles and those irritations come up. Notice the parts where we very readily agree maybe both extreme irritation and extreme immediate agreeing should be something that we can revise and go back. Where did this come from? Is this legitimate? I would want today to be constructive. There is always a space for taking a critical approach to the things that are currently happening or not happening. But I would like to build something, not just to poke holes in the existing thing. Both are valid processes, but today I also want to lean heavier on the constructive side. I would like us to be spacious, and you might go, what does that mean? How do I position myself as spacious? Recently, I've been noticing a topic coming up, or almost like a posture coming up in different discussions that I have found myself a part of, and that is this. It's this idea of holding space. And I'm not only just protecting, you can establish that space like this, but I am trying to hold space whilst expanding myself or stretching myself to be as large as possible, to hold as much as I can possibly hold. And that's what I mean by spacious. I want to expand myself to be able to hold diverse new ideas, to be able to hold tensions, to be able to hold people, as many and as different as possible, and give them that space to be themselves, give them the space to be safe, and for me to kind of stretch myself to new capacity, I could say. And lastly, I would like this to not just be a theoretical discussion of concepts that sit neatly together or don't sit neatly together, but I would like to remind us all that this is also a spiritual exercise. This discussion too is a spiritual exercise. And I believe that there are ways of doing this spiritual exercise with readiness for God's voice to come through, and alternatively with already preconditioned dismissal. And I would invite us to be open to God's voice, and also to be open to actively shutting out voices inside of our heads, from our past, from our present, from our own fears that are trying to sabotage what we hear and what we talk about. Now, maybe that last bit over there is the place where it got kind of squiggly again. Why would I highlight this over all of these other things? Well, I do believe that this is how we put everything together. There's no point in doing all of these other things even as a religious practice or as a faith practice, unless we join it all together into the category of a spiritual practice. So what we're going to talk about can be theological, theoretical, cerebral, and rational. It will be. There are elements, it's a talk. It's going to come with that burden. We're going to discuss social, anthropological, cultural, and contextual concepts. So the idea is that what we are talking about needs to be situated in human reality and in the current context. We are talking about psychological, emotional, and somatic elements, which means that we as a person also hold a world inside of me that comes with its own opportunities, with its own inhibitions, and also with tools that can enable us to engage ourselves better and engage with the world around us better. This will also be a practical, applied, physical, operational discussion. So we will be touching not only on the ideas, the grand big concepts, but also the idea that this is supposed to be a lived reality. And lastly, there are elements of structural and institutional commentary that will go into it, because we have inherited the structures and the institutions. But this is not where I want to put the emphasis today. I want to draw it all together and focus on the spiritual, because it is ultimately a matter of my walk with God and your walk with God and our walk with God, and whether we believe that it is possible for us to do it or not. Having put all of this on the table, I want to return to the feeling that this concept and this practice and this discourse sometimes feels a mess. Let's try to strip that squiggle away from all of this and start with a couple of definitions. What is worship? It's a term that has been over denoted. It has too many connotations. It can get really confusing when somebody talks about worship to understand fully what they mean. So, and very often what has happened is that worship immediately is associated with worship music, especially contemporary worship music. So we come together and we have this section in our service that is called praise and worship, right? And now we do praise and worship. I don't know then what happened before. I don't know what will happen after, and how praise and worship in the form of music is kind of distilled and almost extracted from the rest of the service. But this is how we use that term for some reason. I want to resist that today. I want to, even though I am a musician, I am a singer, I want to strip the concept of worship from that equation mark between worship and music. They are related, but worship does not equal music. This is the working definition for me, responding to all that God is with all that we are. Worship is responding to all that God is with all that we are. That sounds maybe even naive, simplistic at first glance, but I believe it digs into depths, proper depths that I would like to kind of pick apart one by one now. First of all, responding is a carefully chosen word over there. It is not reacting, it is not answering, it is not understanding all that God is. No, it is responding. It implies that there is a divine initiative, which means that for worship to be possible, God has to have done something first. And we know that God has done something first. God is the creator and God is the savior. And we have these things to build on and these things to already respond to. And then the humans and the rest of creation can respond. Response is also something that is active. It is not passive. It doesn't happen to us. And it is intentional. It is not like a reaction, which you could say is just this almost automated response to something. No, response is an intentional move in response to something. And I wanted to add to that it's also natural, because sometimes when we say intentional, it might have this connotation of being somehow forced or being duty based. Or no, if we truly realize what God has done and who God is, then worship is an entirely natural response to it. It is something that comes out of that realization and that experience. So that first word already tells us a lot. And if you think about all the alternative words that could have been there, then you can see why this is a carefully chosen, precise word for that description. Secondly, there's the element of to all that God is. And that implies that theology matters. Worship is a response to the best that we can understand of God, to the maximum revelation that we have of God. If that picture is distorted, then our worshipful response is also distorted. We are responding to something that is twisted, or we are responding to something that has massive gaps in it. Theology matters in our worship. It's crucial that we work hard on understanding what our theology of God, of human, of our interaction is, so that our worship could be solid, rounded, sturdy, set on a good foundation. Secondly, Trinity matters. To all that God is a reference to the idea that we are not talking about just one section of God or one portion of God. We are talking about the three in one. We are talking about Father, Son, and the Spirit. We are talking about the entirety of God's action towards creation, and we are talking about the entirety of God's involvement in our lives today. We are supposed to be also holding tensions between the simultaneously true statements about God, holding tensions between the lion and the lamb, the father and the judge, the king and the sacrifice, the spirit that blows and and the water that sustains. All of these different metaphors are supposed to be almost like overlays that we can look at the same time. And if we have that picture so thick and rich, then our worshipful response will be balanced. We have seen from history what happens when we pick and choose and we create these distorted homunculus creatures, like maybe you know the ones that have been created to express the sensitivity of our neural systems. I don't know if it links to anything to anyone, but these little figures that have a disproportionate elements, like the lips are extremely big because the lips are extremely sensitive, and the fingertips are extremely big, and then there's this little distorted man looking at us. If we have a messed up theology or an unbalanced theology, then our worship will also be unbalanced. It can't sit on a steady basis. There's another tension that needs to be held in that category, and that is what we can and what we can't know about God. We need to remind ourselves that we need to worship God for being accessible to us, but also the inaccessible, because that's what makes God God. The things that we will never be able to grasp, because we are creation and God is creator. And we need to know where the edge of our knowledge is, or where the edge of how much of God we can capture is. And we need to remember that as we set up to worship. The last line, with all that we are, with all that we are. There's 2 points of focus over there. And the first one is the all part. That means holistic anthropology, the whole self, body, mind, and soul. It's a very biblical concept, not to be separating those categories, not to treat the brain separately from the soul or the heart, and separately again from the body as a physical existence. No, we put it all together, the united, intertwined, inseparable one. That thing of me is supposed to be responding to who God is. And that is also what God is addressing, me in my entirety. In addition to that, we're supposed to be able to come to God and respond to God from the background of the whole range of different experiences of human history, of human stories. We're supposed to be able to do it from different emotions. We're supposed to be able to do it from different backgrounds, different stages of life, different stages of faith, different stages of theological maturity, different experiences, different life experiences, experiencing mourning or experiencing rejoicing, experiencing the birth of the children, experiencing massive transitions. All of these things are supposed to be bringable to God. And with all of that, I'm supposed to be able to respond to who God is. And lastly, there's this little element of the we, and that's perhaps the complicated side over there. Who is the we? Ideally, when we come together, we're supposed to do it as a whole community. This definition is intentionally not written in the first person singular, to all that I am, even though with all that I am, even though that would also be not incorrect, it is incomplete. So the part that I think is the complication is precisely that we aspect. It is easier to respond to all that God is with all that I am in my individual setting. I can make it my own. I can live it exactly the way I need it. It can feed my needs. It can be tailored to my tastes. And the moment that we come together, it gets much more complicated. And it's really, it's quite, I would like to first say, it feels quite tragic that we can't find, there's nobody else that can fully see exactly what I need. And I cannot be exactly what they need for anybody else. Not in totality, not in the completeness. And if we walk long enough down the road, then we will find that here it is. The friction has entered the picture, and now the we is a difficulty. The we is a complication, not a support system, but suddenly there's this adversary. There is somebody who is looking at me and is opposing me and is making me wrestle and struggle. So doing congregational worship in that sense is not hard in its principle. It's hard in its practical reality, because we're supposed to be responding to all that God is with all that we are in a communal setting. And that's where the rubber hits the road and stuff gets rough. Now, that's where maybe those tiny little squiggles that I have overtake entirely. They grow into these massive things, and we live with this complication that completely muffles our experiences of worship. The relational aspects and the dissatisfactions and all of these things just overtake. I don't know if you resonate with any of that frustration or fiction, but I want to do a quick kind of leap into the diagnostic section. I don't want to spend too much time here, but I want to acknowledge the reality of it. I want to acknowledge that there are people or phases of our lives that we can describe as years of unmet needs in the church context. We can look at years of theological friction or even theological nausea, having to be in a space on a weekly basis, if not more often, that just squeezes us and molds us and doesn't allow us to breathe. There's years of commitment to a claustrophobic reality, where you walk into a room and you put on a persona and you have these things happening inside of you, but you are not able to share them. You are not able to be fully who you are. You're not able to drop your defenses, and it becomes claustrophobic. And it doesn't strangle only that communal space, but it feeds into it, overflows, and it takes over your personal spiritual spaces the same way, because your needs are unmet. Because you're walking around with a gaping wound and there is nobody taking care of it. Instead, they're putting salt on it, and all you feel is this raw friction. All of this experience, which might be personal, comes from a history of almost like this communal genetics of the movement, of Protestant Christianity, of logocentric Protestant Christianity, of the Adventist path. All of these bits that we have walked, all of these bits that the people before us have walked, have obviously come with distortions that are the natural result of the paths that they have taken. I am not putting blame, because I don't want to play the blame game. I am just saying that every walk comes with hits, and those hits leave bruises. And if those bruises are not attended to for one reason or another, for lack of time, resources, tools, or willingness, then those bruises can become these festering wounds and scars, and they will always be tender. They will always be tender. I believe that there is a time and a purpose to looking at those wounds, to naming them, to full detailed diagnostics. But I also believe that there is no point in sitting by the bedside, poking those bits and staying stuck there. But there's a way to look at those bits and to work on healing and reversing those damaging processes, and to move on ahead to something that is different, to saying that this stops here, that the heritage that I have, I will not pass on to my children, but I will also not pass on the pain and the bitterness that has come from these experiences. So some of these things that we could put our finger on when we talk about the underlying foundations of worship and the way that it has shaped the pathologies that we might detect in our worshipful spaces are here. We have a legacy of damaging anthropology, of not fully having even looked at a human being and decided, who is this thing that is supposed to respond to God? Who is this thing? And we have these narratives of how detrimental it can be to even ask that question, because the moment you start looking into the mirror, you somehow are self-centered. No, The human being is supposed to be able to look into the mirror, is supposed to be able to identify all of the deviations, and is also supposed to be able to rejoice with David and go, I praise you, Lord, for I am fearfully, wonderfully made. Now, and the fearfully, wonderfully made human being making that declaration about themselves, having realized what God has done through creation of the humankind, of me in particular, me with my particular gifting and calling, that part is something that we don't have a good history of doing. We haven't been taught ever since for the children's Sabbath school necessarily that there is value and worth in who I am as an individual human being, not only as a generic representative of a species or a statistical dot in the grand scheme of the legal complication of solving the problem of sin. No, me individually and personally, with my unique configuration, with my identity, with my calling, I am a child of God with a purpose, and there is value in it. Praise to God. We are not used to doing that. And it shows when we come together to worship. We also have a legacy of lack of tools for psychological work. We don't know how to work through our own stuff. We pretend that emotions are something that we can put aside and ignore, and then we pretend that we can do theology pure without the kind of the manifestations of our suppressed emotional lives. We pretend that it is possible for us to somehow do religion and faith and spirituality without addressing our traumas. We believe that it is possible to cancel out the unreliable heart and to read the text with objective cerebral eyes. We also have a legacy of primacy of propositional faith. What I mean there is that faith and true religion is somehow presented to us in a hierarchy. Experience, yes, is there, but the real thing that makes a difference is whether you understand statements about God, statements about the world, and statements about the future. Statements are important because if your understanding of God is distorted, then your worshipful response is distorted. However, this is not all to the story. And the rest of it is not even a supplement to it, but it's supposed to all come together into this wonderful whole that works together as a balanced ball, a sphere, not a triangle of things. There's also a disproportionate focus on proclamation. The idea being that when we come together as a community, our primary job is to make sure that we are on the same page about those propositions so that we could all go out and preach from the same hymn book. That's a very mixed metaphor, but I'm sure that you understood what I meant. The idea is that the function of the church is just to talk at people, those propositions that we have established. And then when we come together and we try to look at who we are as a community and what it means to be together as a group of people who are joined together by the whole Trinity, then we lose our footing because we are not used to doing that. We don't have vocabulary for doing that. And we also don't have practices for doing that particularly well. This also implies that we have a staffed pneumatology, that we have accepted the fact that the Spirit is there and the Spirit inspires and the Spirit is the comforter. But it mainly means that we have limited the work of the Spirit to our discovery of those propositional truths. It is me reading a text about God's work 2,000 years ago where the Spirit can tell us, this is what happened. The Spirit can help me interpret. But I am cutting out the part of the Spirit being here and being real and being active in my individual life and in our communal lives in real time. God with us, not only back then and in the future, but also God with us here, now, and today. And we have a legacy of theology of fear. We don't fully trust God's salvation. We don't fully trust that I can be all right with God unless I walk a very tight walk. And because I am not entirely sure that I have fully grasped what that tight walk entails, then I would be best to stick to the center of it in case there might be a slippery slope somewhere. I operate out of the fear of misstepping, not the joy of following. And that legacy reduces any chances that we have of any kind of experimentation with our communal spaces. Because what if we lose our footing? What if we try something and it doesn't work? What if we try something and it doesn't work? And that immediately means that it is wrong. Oof, that's the diagnostics. That is the legacy that we have. Now we have two options of working forward from here. We can either let that legacy and those bruises that we have currently identified, we can let that thing overwhelm all of our communication channels with God and with the body of Christ, the church of God, the fellowship. Or we can try to intentionally resist that those bruises determine my faith and my belief of what God can do. I would like to passionately call for a reset at this point. I would like to call for pushing everything off the table, looking into the mirror, trying to look at my own bruises and trying to put aside, at least on hold, those filters that are currently making it difficult for me to believe that anything else is possible. And I would like to call for a reset to look at the potential of that space. I would like to do that in 3 parts. First of all, the what, then the who, and then the how. The what. We already had this on the slide. Congregational worship is responding to all that God is with all that we are in a communal setting. Now, we put all of those squiggles and all of those complications off the table. They're away, out of the picture. And it's true that this definition doesn't only apply to a congregational worship as a service. It is supposed to be a whole life response. It is supposed to be the idea that there is a community of people who are walking in sync, who are aligned with the divine intention, and they are making a difference 7 days a week. They are responding to who God is and what God is doing 7 days a week. They are following that calling with that joy, and they are constantly responsive to God. Now, I want to put that on the table with a great emphasis and seal it and say that is absolutely true. I do want to focus on what we do when we come together, though, as a community, on those special occasions of a service or a meeting or for that gathering. Not because it is more important, but because it is also important. And because we can't talk about all of these things at the same time, then currently my focus will be on that. So I want to kind of move on and qualify this definition a little further even, which then says that congregational worship service or gathering would perhaps even be better, is an intentionally curated space that facilitates responding to all that God is with all that we are in a communal setting. Let me read that again so that we can all think along. Congregational worship gathering is an intentionally curated space that facilitates responding to all that God is with all that we are in a communal setting. It is a wonderful thing. It is actually also, if it works, when it works, then it does 2 things at the same time. It both expresses and it forms, both individually and communally. It is my response to God, but as I am responding, God is not just passively sitting back and listening, but God is engaging. God is leaning forward and we are leaning forward, and there's an exchange. And that exchange can be transformative. It can be experiential. It can be something that changes and carries our lives. Who's supposed to do that? And I'm sure that even if we all have entirely managed to walk this walk with me up to this point without any kind of irritations or negative memories, then perhaps this is the place where you're like, who is responsible? And you can think of some of those experiences of walking away from such a space and feeling a tinge of dissatisfaction, feeling like, this was not done right, this was too short, this was too long, that was too loud, that was too quiet, this was too messy, that was too clinical. All of these things that we have, all of those elements of that space that we can pick apart and somehow assess. We can measure them, we can assess them, we can pass evaluations. Who is to blame when it doesn't work? I want to present to you the traditional model of a congregational worship service and the assumptions very broadly about it. There are these elements that come together, just very schematically drawn out over here. There are, if you start from the gentleman holding the book with a cross, that is the pastor. Then there are these other elements in the service who might be the worship leaders or elders or the prayers or the deacons or anyone else who is up there or out there doing the service for other people. And then there's the rest of the congregation in its diversity. In church, it seems that we hold the people who prepare that space often responsible for the success of what happens in that space. We talk about, let's say, the worship leaders and the pastors or the elders who are supposed to be preparing the program. And the assumption is that they do the work of preparation throughout the week, and then they somehow get inspired by the divine and they have a message for us. There's a message. We believe that God does God's part and has a message, a meaningful message, and God passes that on to the organizers who are now inspired to prepare a service. They have communicated with God, they have received from God what to share with the rest of the congregation. And then we all come together and they share. And as I said, Spirit can have the role of then facilitating that passing of the message of the both the handing side and the receiving side. So God can inspire the process of mediation of that message. And if it is a really successful service, then at the end, the congregation will have also received the message from God. The inspired message that reveals to God to them a little more, that gives them a glimpse of who God is, enables them to have the encounter that elicits their response. And now they are ready for the response. Now they are ready to worship. A lot of responsibility in this model is on the pastor and the leader. If they fail, the service fails. There's also the assumption that if the service fails, they have failed. We worry about how to bring it all together. We worry about the form. We take good care of not leaving any gaps into the service in case the congregation just falls through the cracks. We want to make sure as the leaders, the pastors, the elders, that a good service picks up the congregation, carries the congregation across, and then puts them down gently on the other side where they will have been enlightened. Now, there's a revised model that I would like to propose today, and that already starts completely differently. The week looks like this. We are looking at a whole life response to God's action in our lives. We are looking at people who come already having had engaged with the divine. And I am not talking about, but what if there's somebody who's going through a difficult time and they can't? That is entirely legitimate. That is their struggle and that is what they bring to the table. But what if there are people who come in from the outside who have never even thought about God explicitly and just happen to walk into the pews? I am not talking about that just because they haven't had explicit talks about God doesn't mean that they haven't been walking their walk with God. And somehow they stepped into that church. Still, they have a path with God. They are already responding to God's initiative. I feel like the ones who fall through the cracks are the ones who live that reality with complacency. The ones who are not wrestling with anything, but the ones who are just indifferent, right? The ones who just couldn't be bothered. I know those moments in my life when I'm just like, I know the choices that I have in front of me. I know, and And if I have and I come with an it is very difficult for the pastors and the elders and the congregational leaders to do anything much to make that space meaningful for me. This reality, though, means that we come forward-leaning by default. We come forward-leaning and we don't only lean forward to listen to something that is passed on to us. We all lean forward congregationally to share a space, to share our walk with God, to share an experiential reality that we know to be true. It looks different then. It is a congregational responding to God's initiative that can then be facilitated and curated into additional little bonus elements. But we are ready to respond as we come. Now, in that revised model, everybody is a worship leader. Everybody is a teacher. Everybody is a worship leader because everybody has a part in shaping that space that either facilitates or hinders the encounter between the human and the divine. That model also takes off some of their responsibility, whilst the first point currently puts responsibility on everyone, but it also takes off the load of kind of responsibility and the loads of frustration from the leaders, because they also need to realize that they cannot do God's work for God. Only God can transform. Only God is the one who can touch hearts. And it is our only chance in that space is to provide a space that holds, with all of the tension and all of the care and love, that space in which God can maximally reach out to people. We can facilitate it, or we can be complete zero as an element in that equation, or we can actively hinder it based on the choices that we make when we come to congregational worship. Congregational worship service. How? How is it possible to create such a space? Is it possible? I want to go a bit more practical now. First of all, by returning to the idea of creating and holding spaces. Now, this is why I feel like this movement that I am making is so important. It is not about establishing a space. It is about opening up a space. It is about opening up a space for people to feel like they are cared and they have been given permission to bring everything that they are to God. It is my job to hold that space. If I am up on that platform or if I am sitting in the pews for the people around me, I am the one holding that space. And I'm supposed to kind of arch this way because I want to leave them that safety, but I also want to protect and defend. So my back turns into a shield and my arms turn into embrace. That's what we are supposed to do as individuals and as a congregation when we come together, so that everyone has space to meaningfully relate and respond to God. Meaningful over there is a key term, because that requires now a little leap into kind of studies of how we make meaning in the first place. I love this, and I think I've cited this before. I love this definition by Clifford Geertz of culture, which is culture is a web of significance. Well, man is an animal suspended in a web of significance that he himself spins. The idea that we are all somehow positioned in this web that we have inherited or created, and if something touches it, then it resonates, or it what's the word, it vibrates, right? And if something vibrates, we understand something is going on, we respond to it, we register it, and we feel like something is happening, this is relevant, this is meaningful to me. I can detect where it happened, it links to other parts of my web, and it becomes somehow significant to me. Now, for us to create a space in which people can be addressed meaningfully, we need to understand what the web is like, what the web of individuals is like, what comes with certain meanings, what signifies what, and we need to operate with that. We need to somehow figure out what are the networks of meaning that people create, and then speak into that. So it's crucial that we understand who the people are that we are doing community and communal worship together with, so that we would know how to create a space that is meaningful also to them. We need to leave space for people to make meaning, not just like stick things and truths and ideas onto them, but actually give them the space to make meaning, to engage, to interpret, to digest, to import their own experiences and make sense of it for themselves. That is what a good worshipful space does. Because if it is just my presentation of what I have experienced it and what I believe to be true at them, expecting them to just parrot it back, that's not meaning, that's reproduction. We need to hold space for people to interpret in a way that becomes personally meaningful to each of them, because only this way can it be transformative. Only this way can God actually encounter that person, not only witness me lecturing somebody else. That would be such a shame. God came to church and just to listen to me lecture instead of being held the space for to meet people. I am a big believer in spontaneity and spirit-led inspiration and all of these things, but also in being intentional. I work in education. I have grown up in a family that does that. The idea that things go better when we don't let it entirely be taken over by chance. And I believe that congregational worship services benefit from intentionality, benefit from this idea that you take people on a journey that starts from somewhere and ends somewhere. And it is easier for them to be taken along, to be opening their hearts, to be also picked up as individuals in a congregation, if we are intentional about what we do together, if we don't leave it to chance. I also believe that there's a value in aiming for a conceptual whole, a thematic journey or an emotional journey within that one experience. I believe we have examples of services where we don't really understand how one thing follows from another, and it's quite difficult. It's a cognitive and emotional dissonance to be. Oh, I have this wonderful example of one time that people were really excited about the idea of doing a very active and very upbeat countdown to a congregational service, so that when people were all gathered in the hall, they would put up on the slide, and there would be this ticking and this general anticipation, and the countdown would go, and then you would have the people count with you, and you would go 10, 9, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then the elder would come up and go, and let us now bow our heads for silent prayer. And you're just like, you know, now suddenly we had people with us and now we just dropped them into the ditch because there's no conceptual whole. There is no emotional journey that makes sense. It is not smooth. We've just hit a pothole on our road and everybody's bums felt that. And now to be able to actually join that silent prayer, people had to do so much extra, both cognitive kind of cerebral logical work, but also emotional work. And I'm not sure that they were able to meet that task with great commitment. I also believe in thematic journeys that take people from a lived reality to an idea that we would like to leave them with in that particular experience. Let's say that we have determined that it would be a good idea to talk about the goodness of God, right? Then there's a way of building that experience so that the end of it lands in reality. But you can't just start hammering people with that same idea throughout the service, but you start from experiences where this has not been the case. You leave space for people to come with their frustrations. You invite them to express the sadness or the grief or the dissatisfaction. You invite them to acknowledge the fact that some of them are just numb. And then you pick them up and you sing the songs, or you do the texts, or you share experiences and you preach the sermon, or you remind them of what God has done and what God is still doing. And at the end, they would be able to go, hey, God is good. If you take them on an experiential journey, their readiness to respond to something is higher, and that space serves its function much more efficiently. I also believe that there is a certain set of values that we can always bring to congregational worship. But I believe that those values might taste and look different from context to context, depending on the exact web of meanings that we inhabit as that particular community, depending on the situation, on the context, depending on the types of people that you have in the congregation. Maybe it's a generationally particular context. Maybe it's a culturally or ethnically particular context. So all of these things might look different in the practical reality, but I believe in the underlying values as always being there. Authenticity, the idea that we can't fake our spiritual journeys, and there is great value in being real. I'm also a millennial, so you would only expect me to say this, like I'm fitting a stereotype right now. I believe in communication, because to take people on a journey, they need to be narrated at least through parts of it so that they would understand that they're on a journey. And I also believe in quality, which is always in balance, in tension, in balance with inclusivity. But I also believe that there should be an aiming towards quality. I think I haven't put down the most important part of how to plan and organize and create a meaningful, worshipful space. And I think this is here. By practicing the gift of discernment of God's voice. I operate with the assumption that my God is a forward-leaning God, and not only universally, but also particularly and personally. I believe in a God who believes in engaging with my local community and my local congregation, no matter how small or big, no matter how twisted, no matter the theological heritage or the complications or the histories. I believe that God is a forward-leaning God with the intention to reach out and transform, to liberate and to provide freedom and joy and peace. Now, the only way that the spaces that I create for worship can actually facilitate God's encounter with my community is if I do it hand in hand with God, so that I understand what are God's intentions for this community and for me, for the time that we spend together, instead of just inventing things for God and then going like, didn't work, thus distant. Asterisk here, I know that none of this is as black and white and as easy as I would like it to be. And discernment is one of those complicated things. How do I distinguish my own voice from God's voice? How do I distinguish the religious voices that I have inherited from God's voice? How do I distinguish? How do I know that it is God that I am hearing when I am trying to discern God's voice? And that's why I didn't say practice, just like discern. I said practice the gift of discernment. I believe that there is a value in approaching it with humility, but with determination, with going, God, I want to hear your voice. I want to understand what you are doing in this community. I want to understand what you want to do through me. And I want to start experimenting in that direction. Let's go. And slowly but surely, I believe that it is possible for us too to be walking the walks that we read about in the Old Testament and the New Testament, of discerning God's voice and finding ways how to be in alignment with our actions and with our space provision, be in alignment with what the divine initiative currently is in my community and in the lives of the people around me. I also believe that God does not make us do things that go against the identity of who God has made us be. So no matter how weird it will first seem, I believe that God has intentions for us that flow along the channels that God has created inside of us. So it should feel organic. There might be resistance because of our distortions, but ultimately working with God should feel organic and come with peace. Congregational worship service then. The how. There's one more element that I want to highlight, and that is the element that I understand that this is not an easy walk, and nobody should walk into this with this naivete that I just flick a switch and suddenly we are all enlightened and transformed, and the amount of transformation experience every Sabbath. No, I also think that this is work. It's organic and comes with peace, but it is still labor to hold that space, to extend yourself. And it is about holding the tensions within that space that is important. Not to fall one side or the other, but holding that central line between the divine and the human, between what I can do and what I am responsible for, and what God can do and I cannot be responsible for, that I cannot produce, that I cannot dictate. Also the element that there is a divine element in the body of Christ, and there is definitely a human element in the body of Christ. And we should be able to discern which is which when we assess our current reality and also the potentials that we have. We should be aiming for the balance between holding space for diversity, but also recognizing the distortions that are not welcome in that space. Now, this is already where you can see that, this is where it gets complicated. And we all know the paradox of tolerance, to bring a very extreme example. But also theologically, it is very difficult to come together to worship a God when you believe that that God is selective in salvation. When you preach a God who is selective in salvation, when you preach a God who is a punisher instead of a savior. So the questions of distortions are something that we should look out for, whilst we hold space for as much diversity as possible. We should also hold tensions between the individual and the communal. My individual needs and our communal needs. Because if we come together as a diverse body, the needs are diverse. I believe that there is a place in declaring, but I need this. And I believe that there is a space in the body of Christ to be worshipping vicariously through somebody else's needs being met. And I think a good example of that would be if we truly love somebody, you know, and we have planned a good gift for them and we know that this is their love language, you know, or if we plan Christmas for children, you know, maybe you're that person, maybe you're a parent, or maybe you're an aunt or an uncle, or maybe you're a grandparent, and you know those times when Christmas was this magical time, and then you remember those years in between when Christmas was just Christmas. And I'm sorry if you don't celebrate Christmas. I do massively, and it's one of the big family holidays, so this is the example that you're getting. And now I'm looking at Christmas differently again, because I have small children who get excited and I get to prepare that Christmas for them. So I am experiencing the Christmas joy vicariously through them. And I believe that it is possible to come together as a congregation and also worship vicariously through seeing somebody else's needs being met, whilst maybe the thing that I am looking at is not my cup of tea, but I see a fellow congregational member or somebody who walked in from the street or somebody who is sitting behind me, them being touched in a meaningful way, them feeling like this is my space, this is for me, I am experiencing God, this is my cup of tea, I'm getting my cup of tea. And it is possible for me to feel genuine joy in that moment, in that recognition of God being bigger than me and God reaching out to people that I can't fully 100% relate to, but still reaching out and touching hearts. And in some ways, then rejoicing in a God that is bigger than me is sometimes even a greater reason to be worshipful and to respond. The realization that it's covered, the realization that as God is attending to the needs of those people right now that I can't fully understand or relate to, God will also take time to address my needs, even if it is not somebody else's cup of tea. Now, you might put an asterisk there and go like, but what if you have a community who does not operate that way? And then I believe in the moments where we need to go, but hey, I haven't been fed for years. I need something from this space. I need something in the body of Christ to happen that would be meaningful for me and would touch me and would enable me to resonate with what God is doing. It's almost like you know, like nerves being squished so that parts of your body no longer function, and then there's gangrene ultimately, right? But that's what we are talking about. We are talking about a body that doesn't let the blood circulate or doesn't let the nerves transfer all of the communication through all of the parts of Christ's body. And we need to remember that balance between the individual and communal, because the individual attention will also lead to communal welfare of the body. Comforting versus challenging, bringing people together. I wanted to put down comforting, but comforting can sometimes go into comfortable as a comfort zone. And there's a space in stretching and there's a space in embrace. And we need to be able to discern, to be able to identify which is the right operation right now in the way that we go about shaping that space. There's a balance in giving and there's a balance in receiving. There's a balance in the universal and the balance in the particular. There are elements that we can agree probably need to be there. Maybe the prayer, maybe an idea, maybe just the fact that we come together as a community. But there are also the particulars, the things that we can identify and establish as a local community without the need to look elsewhere for guidance and to dictate the norms. And then there's this everlasting balance between the ideal and the real. The fact that I can talk about this all I want and I can dream about this all I want. God can dream about the body of Christ and his church on earth all he wants. But the real is not yet here in that shape and form. which means that as I am leaning towards the ideal and holding up the standards, as I am subscribing to those values and those practices, I also need to hold space for the failure to perform at that level, for the failure of me to show up with intention, to show up with readiness to expand myself and hold space, with the limited resources, with the traumas and the scars that we all come with. And we need to somehow hold the balance between these two. Now, this looks like hard work, and maybe you felt that little scribble thing coming up again, like this is hard work, holding all of these things in balance. It feels like you're standing in the middle of the field with ropes attached to both of your hands, and somebody's pulling from both sides, and you feel like you might be breaking up in the middle. And I believe that this is the reality of many leaders in the church. They feel like they are being torn apart, they're being quartered. Well, yes, that is the reality. But as I said earlier about that muffling of the channels because of our experiences and the pathologies in our heritage, I also want to highlight that the tensions and the labor of it should not be taking away from God's potential to engage and to change. There was this wonderful episode of the QI that I saw just the other day where David Mitchell, the British comedian, said, and this was in relation to science, he's not particularly a man of God, but his comment on current cultural patterns was, we are in trouble as a species when people refuse to believe in things that they couldn't actually do themselves. And I believe this to be true also for us as believers. We are truly in trouble as believers, as a church, as leaders, as worshippers, as members of a community, if we refuse to believe in things that I myself cannot do myself or haven't seen happen myself. If this happens, if we lose faith in the possibility of God's work, this happens to the concept of worship. And I know that it's hard to remember that footnote, but life is real, but it is not going to be exactly ideal. Yes, it is not going to be exactly ideal, but my reality should not be dictating God's possibility of engagement with God's people. I would like you to walk away today with these questions. What could be your first steps towards curating communal spaces that facilitate the encounter? It might happen in a community that you already have or in a community that is yet to be born. What is holding you back? That's the place that immediately starts going bzzz. And what are the ways around and or through it? Because naively, perhaps, but passionately, I believe that it is possible to walk through or around those obstacles and to be a part of the community of God's people that hold that space for people. It is possible to come together to worship, to feel that enrichment of coming together, to feel being a part of the same walk, to experience the value and the worth of being a community, of expressing our reality as a community and being woven tighter together as a community through communal worship, through sharing, through responding together, and through being transformed together. And I believe that it is possible for those things in collaboration with the Spirit of God to be reduced, diminished, and made insignificant. That's my proposal for the reset. Now I'm all yours to shoot at.
Thank you so much, Kärt, for a well thought out and insightful presentation. The chat has definitely been a buzz, and so I'm going to invite some more of you to raise your hands. But yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Lauren, your hand was up pretty early. Please go ahead and get the conversation started.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I was just holding on to everything that you said. I've been interested in while watching the chat while you were speaking and people's reactions. And it's interesting that a lot of the reactions, Kärt, had to do with, I wish some of this could happen in my church, but I don't know how it could possibly happen. Some people blamed the pastors because they are too rigid and they don't want to change. My experience was the opposite. I wanted to change things, and usually it was the church leaders that said, "No, you can't change that. You've got to leave that the way it always was. We always have to have these elements to it."
Mm.
I was thinking what came to my mind as you were explaining was leaving Walla Walla College with the church, with the pipe organ and the choir and really good preaching and everything. And suddenly I was a pastor. And I moved to the northern edge of North Dakota, Bottineau, North Dakota, right on the Saskatchewan border. And suddenly I was the pastor. And there were 25 people in church on a really good day. And we were the only young people. That was it. And they didn't want to try anything new. I thought, well, with these few people, we could sit in a circle and talk. But no, they wanted me to, even though I was the only one who could, on Sabbath, could walk, they wanted me to process onto the platform. And since I was the piano player also, I had to play The Lord is in His Holy Temple and then go and kneel down. And then when we took up the offering, I had to play uh, whatever the offering song was, and then I had to pass the plate. I mean, we had to go through the whole ritual.
Mm.
I can't say that it was meaningful in any particular way to me, and but apparently it was to them.
Mm.
They wanted it done that way. They felt like there was lacking anything very exciting. The ritual was the thing that mattered. I still think back on that. It's like my touchstone of going from one Sabbath, I was at Walla Walla College Church. The next Sabbath, there I was in this tiny little church in North Dakota and trying to make something meaningful happen. I don't know that I did very well at it. And I sometimes look over my whole career and wonder if I did any better as time passed. Because each church I went to had their pattern that they had to do it in a certain way. I so much want to, I wish I could go back now and
Mhm.
do what you're describing here and try to make something meaningful. But I'm not quite sure if I could, Kärt.
Mm.
I'm not sure if there was sufficient flexibility anywhere in the system along the way to make this meaningful thing happen. So that's my comment to you. I'm not sure it's very optimistic. I wish it were more optimistic.
No,
But
and I keep on fluctuating between that. I keep on fluctuating as a member of the church, as a worship leader, as a teacher. I keep on fluctuating between the question of can I make a meaningful change, or is this just an illusion? Is this just am I fooling myself ultimately? And I think that that's only also natural to be thinking in those terms.
yeah,
Um, the complication with that with a meaningful, the word meaningful in that, and what constitutes meaningful is precisely that for some people, as you said, this was the meaning, right? And the ritual had become
yeah,
the carrier of the meaning, even though originally the meaning it was just a facilitator of the meaning. Now it was a carrier of the meaning, and they had been equated to each other. And it is very difficult to get out of those moments, because then when you start breaking those bits apart, you are breaking apart people's systems, their lives, their temples. You are demolishing
That's right.
all of it, and they experience it as such. So it is a really complicated reality. Having said that, the idealist in me still wants to believe. I'm obsessively believing that some of this is possible when it is approached from inside out. Because I feel like a lot of those discussions, and this is not a commentary on your practices as a pastor, Lauren, at all. And I have no idea what went down, and I have no idea what. So this is a general comment, general theoretical comment that anyone can test and write to me afterwards and say if there was any value to this or not. I believe that there is a value in approaching the entire discussion of worship from the inside out, from exactly those values. And then, because whenever we do these longer seminars, and I have to find a moment later, I have to find the website, because there's an arts and worship conference coming at Andrews at the end of Valentine's Day, basically, where we will also be joining forces with the Andrews University, with Dr. David Williams and others, to be actually talking about worship and arts and expanding that space more. So whenever we do these talks, then I always invite people to think about the fact that our professed values and our practices are currently not meeting. Like, if you start digging from the surface to the core of it, you end up in a different spot than if you start digging from the core out. And that shouldn't be the case. And I think whenever we start kind of changing things, you take that mark on the ground, and you're like, this should be there, this should be half a kilometer that way, then people get really upset. And they get upset justifiably, because for decades they have been here and they have built their lives around it. But when you invite them to the core and you start digging out from the core with them, then that is easier to accept. That then they look out at the point where you then reach the surface and they go, hey, this is not where we put up camp. Like, we should move our camp here, because this is where we should be if we actually believe in a God who is forward leaning, if we actually believe in a God who is inclusive, if we believe that there is more to the human being than just their brain, and more to spirituality than just proclamational truths, if we believe that it is our job as a body of Christ to take care of each other and accept the diversity also in worship, if we believe that there is a holistic human being, body, mind, and soul, which we profess to believe in our health ministries, but we do not actually exercise in our worship context. If we believe that we are supposed to come together as a body of Christ generationally and culturally, like overarching and still being meaningful. And if we then also understand how meaning is made, and that it is always contextual and always cultural, and we should be taking that into our equation, then we do come out at that spot. Now, and that spot now does not dictate to us exactly what the form of it should look like. But we now have a ground of systems of values that enable us to have a discussion about what this form should look like in our context, in our web of significance. And that is why whenever anyone starts discussing the forms with me, what do you think about, especially music, right? Or what do you think about doing this? Or what do you think about doing that? Then I always want to kind of like, wait, we can't have that discussion unless we have established the core of it and the values, and then pull that line from the depths of it. And when we do that, then what I have discovered is that people might still feel deeply uncomfortable with what is suggested, but they can't deny me, and perhaps with me some other people, the validity of something that is different. And that, of course, then depends on the emotional maturity of the person, whether they are able to make that leap and hold that space, kind of. It might still be uncomfortable for them to let go of some things, and that's only normal, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
But I naively believe in the possibility of discussion.
All right, thank you so much for that. I want to follow up on Lauren's question, sharing an experience that I've had. So the faith community that I was a part of just before I left Jamaica was New Kingston Fellowship, and that congregation was established to primarily reach young professionals, recognizing that the traditional worship service was not appealing to people like me. And so the service started at 9:30, which surprisingly was an issue for persons because in Jamaica, church starts at 9:15. And that 15 minutes seemed to have made such a big difference. And then also, because a lot of us wouldn't be coming back in the afternoon for Bible class, we would actually have Bible class right after Sabbath school. And then the pastor now gets 15 minutes to do an exhortation. And that created such a stir because there are persons who are like, oh, it's an offshoot, and how can you worship like that? And there are even some of my friends that I would invite them, and it's like, come experience it for yourselves. They're like, no, how can you go to a church that is so different? And then one of my favorite parts of the service, and I saw some persons in the chat say this, is that we'd have lunch together every Sabbath. And so that was really meaningful. And so while those of us who were there appreciated it, there were so many others within Kingston and East Jamaica who are like, there is something wrong with this. This is not an Adventist church. And it's just something that we had to deal with because it was meaningful. And that may be why I'm having such a hard time finding a home church in Barbados. But Adventist Today has really, really filled that space of community for me. So, there's different ways to worship, as you've said, and it's about finding what is meaningful for you and just kind of blocking out all of the other voices who probably just won't understand, and they probably don't even need to understand what makes worship meaningful for you. I know there wasn't really a question in there. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but yeah.
I do want to kind of latch onto that tiny little bit of people feeling really uncomfortable with somebody doing things differently. And I think this is related to the idea that we have a legacy of this type of propositional pinpointing of things, right? That you can pinpoint the right thing and the right, also not just the principle, but the right way of doing or the right way of being. And suddenly when somebody does things differently, then it is not just different, but it is also an affront to your choices. It is somehow delegitimizing what you have been doing. And that's, I think, why it gets so personal. Because now suddenly, if this is right, does this mean that what I am doing is wrong? And we just don't have this. It is not written into our constitution as loudly as it should be that there is this permission for people to do things slightly differently. And yeah, we don't give that permission to people. And then when somebody takes that, then it is suddenly an attack on what my choices have been. So it's a panic attack. And there's also a layer of grief, I think, related to any time that people kind of leave from the church. And we see a lot of that type of lashing out, which originally actually just comes from the fact that they're gone, They left us, I'm being deserted. They thought that was better, which means that I am not good enough. Which just means that we really should be working on improving our emotional health in general in the church. And the psychological tools of just looking into the mirror and going like, I'm having a hard time, but it's not their fault.
That is a whole other conversation.
That is a whole other conversation.
Ed Rife Snyder, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Kärt, it's obvious that you have thought deeply about this subject. And you've arranged your presentation beautifully. As a matter of fact, if I were not retired, I would want you to join me in my consulting firm. You had reset in your title, and this is a subject where reset is very difficult. Probably less due to pastors than to congregations.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm really going to reset it. This, what I'm likely to say, is may be viewed with alarm by some. I think the problem that we start with is the word worship.
Aha.
Worship, has meanings like adoration, homage, honor.
Mm-hmm.
And these words are the words related to kings and sovereigns of past centuries.
Mm-hmm.
We've adopted it into Christianity. The whole concept of kingship and
Mm-hmm.
subjects and worship and so on and so forth is right out of the playbook of leadership in previous centuries. We picked it right up, of course. We even have a hymn called "Oh, Worship the King."
Mm-hmm.
So that is not the language of creation.
Mm-hmm.
The language of creation says, let's make man in our image.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, what does that mean? It also says, I want you to have dominion over the earth. It says, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. So let's grow this planet. Let's build God's creation. Let's take what he did and let's build on it, because we're in God's image, and that's what he does, and that's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Then he says, I want you to work it and keep it. Now, the picture I get of that is not, oh, worship the king. It's a picture of partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And in this partnership, the partners have different roles, but it is a partnership. In actuality, God relies on us to keep up our end of the partnership. I liken it myself, to those of you who've been exposed to this sort of thing, I liken it to a limited liability company, where there's a general partner that carries all the risk or most of the risk, and then there are limited partners that have roles to play. They don't carry all the risk, but they are part of the partnership. Where I'm going with this is I'm wondering, what if we drop the word worship from our church service naming and called it a partnership meeting? Now, we wouldn't probably call it that, but let's assume that's what it really is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a meeting among the partners. What would we do in a partnership meeting? How would we think about the church service differently if we didn't view it as a worship the king kind of thing, but a meeting with our general partner? And I just think it would be fun to spend some time trying to reimagine what it would all be like if we viewed it more as meeting with our partner than as somebody has to convince us of something.
Mm-hmm.
So I just throw that out there for what it's worth. I see Linda smiling. She's thinking this is crazy. Just one other comment. You use the term about curating spaces quite often in your
I did.
presentation. Well, when you say curate space, to me, it is a physical space.
Mm-hmm. And I expanded that metaphorically.
And I know from working with architects and designers that when they think about space, they spend a lot of time trying to imagine how they could manage the space, how they could construct the space in a way that is conducive to the specific activity that will take place there.
Mm.
It's not an accident when a space winds up feeling right for whatever it is you're doing. And I don't think we spend much time in our fellowship curating spaces that actively enhance the experience. We just build utilitarian buildings for the most part.
We do.
So I throw that out there as how would we reimagine our church service if we actually viewed it as we were meeting with the general partner? What would be the agenda of the meeting? What would we hope as an outcome for that meeting? What would it mean to me if I were meeting with the general partner and I'm a limited partner, but I still have responsibilities toward the partnership? How do I carry out my responsibilities to the partnership? How do I learn my responsibilities to the partnership?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, crazy stuff, but that's what I'm throwing out. I'm actually, Lauren, trying to write an article on that.
Yeah, I would definitely think that this would be a fantastic exercise to do. And in general, like this also opens up an entire theological box of covenantal relationship, which is also kind of a contract, but a little more than just a contract, and exactly with the ideas of the outlining of the responsibilities of the parties in that covenant. I would like to, as that idea of, frankly, because I mentioned that there is a value in actually looking at almost like this pile of transparencies, each of which is a metaphor that we use to understand who God is and how God functions towards the creation. Then it would be wonderful to look at each of these elements, right? There's the partner element, there's the father element, there's another element, there's the creator, there's all of these things. So actually look at what each of these metaphors would bring to that space and how our relationship would be different. I didn't mention at the beginning, even though I could have, there's the idea of a really good friend of mine, Belinda Samari, operates with this wonderful metaphor of the council of selves, when she talks about how to look at the different voices or the different parts inside of you affecting the way that we do decision making, for example. That in certain decisions, certain voices in our heads or certain ideas or certain patterns and certain narratives overtake. They kind of grab the mic and they scream the loudest, and this is the thing that is then going to determine how we make that choice. Psychologists operate with these ideas of kind of like the inner child and the inner adult, which is a similar parallel, that you have these different parts inside of you that take on different roles. And it would be wonderful to do that for ourselves when we look at coming to all that I am to God, to look at all of these selves that I have, the child in me and the adult in me and the organizer in me and the wild one in me. And can all of these selves be brought to God? Can all of them have access to God? Do we think that all of them are worthy of being brought in the presence of God? But also then in the other way around, when I think of all the metaphors that have been used about God, then can I approach the Father? Can I approach the King? Can I approach the partner? Can I approach all of these things? And we will find that some of these parts of God we will feel so much more comfortable with, sometimes legitimately, but also sometimes because we haven't been able to integrate the full thing and hold full space to all of who God is. On that comment on the worship element, now I feel like the linguist in me wants to go back and check whether worship was originally attributed to God, that then the earthly realms hijacked in declaring themselves the divine creatures, or it went the other way around. And I suspect that maybe it was the royalty that claimed the place of the divine and thus ended up demanding that they be worshipped. So in that sense, it's been hijacked, but the field of significance and the kind of like the the part of the web that it pings when we use that word is definitely related to that history as well. So needs to be taken into consideration when we use the word. I would love if that was a neutral word that we could just invent, that would be able to just like be burdenless.
All right,
Thank
maybe
you
we
so
can
much.
come up with
Yeah.
something by the end of these discussions. Bob Johnson, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Thank you, Kärt. I think I liked all that I heard you say, but it was a bit abstract to me.
Aha.
Do you know of any congregation that is doing it right? And if so, could you describe concretely how they conduct their worship service? And I don't have any problem with the word worship personally, but is it like going to a great concert? Is it like going to a political rally? Is it like going to a group therapy session? Is it like a Berkshire Hathaway shareholders meeting? Or is it something different from all of that? Could you put a little flesh on the bones?
Yes, I think that's kind of, you're pointing at my permanent flaw, and I'm not going to help it in my response. The permanent flaw being that I get so excited about the theory of it that then it remains too theoretical. The reason why I am resisting on putting the flesh on the bones is that I believe that the flesh does not determine whether it is right. I believe that I'm just following your metaphor in that. I believe that it can be done right, and that doing right can result in so many different ways of looking. I believe that it is possible to do a worship concert right. I believe that it is possible to do a conservative sandwich service with a prayer, hymn, sermon, hymn, prayer, go home right. I believe that it is possible to do a fellowship meal together instead of a service and do it right. I believe that it is the measurement of whether it is done right is whether it is done spiritually led, whether it is done with a congregation in mind and the congregation's needs in mind, and whether it enables the people to come together and meet God. And that's the true measurement of it. And it might look different in different places because of their permanent context. So it might look different in, let's say, in a tiny 15 people aging church in an English village every Sabbath, from how it looks in a vibrant large church in London. And every Sabbath it will look different because one context is meaningful in one shape and the other context is meaningful in another shape. But I also believe that it is possible to play around with the forms, and that it is possible for there to be churches that can on one weekend do a traditional sandwich service meaningfully, and another weekend do a contemporary worship service with a lot of music, or do something completely different. So in that sense, I am so sorry, I'm going to remain abstract, because I believe that the values are the thing that determines whether it is right, whether we adhere to the principles of meeting what God is doing in that community and looking at how that looks, that space should look like now. It's kind of similar to planning kids' birthday parties, I'm realizing, because mine are coming up. And I am listening to their likes and I'm listening to their needs, and one wants it entirely green and the other one wants it entirely purple, and one is interested in science and the other one's love language is fluffy and glittery. And if I want that space to be meaningful to them, then those two birthday parties will look entirely different depending on the children for whom the birthday party is. And I believe that in some ways, the shape that a congregational worship takes is right, not measured by its objective characteristics, but whether it fits the congregation and enables them to meet God.
Well, I agree that the specific form that a congregation may choose to follow is rather situational, but I think you can still answer my question. Do you know some congregation that is doing it right for their situation?
I know congregations who are intentionally working towards doing it right. I am a member of one such congregations, which is at Newbold Church, which has a strong leadership that is aiming towards that and is working towards that really hard. It's also a large church, so it's very hard to be dynamic, but it is doing its best. And I know that there are local initiatives that look very different from this, also around here in England, that I have visited, that are doing it right. I have examples also from outside of Adventism of places where they seem to be doing it right, even though I disagree with some of their theological propositions. But they seem to be looking at their communities and responding and making it possible for the community to respond.
Did you attend one of their services?
Yes.
Could you describe it?
Yes, I can. To what purpose?
I think it would put flesh on the bones. Now, I'm not saying that any other place would have to duplicate what they do, but it would illustrate the possibility of fulfilling what you're saying.
Yes, an example of a place where I didn't expect it to happen, but I was blown away, was the church, the St. Aldate's Church, which is an Anglican church in Oxford. And we walked in with a group of people who were there actually doing a tour of different worships as a part of a worship leading seminar. And it is situated right across Christ Church College, which is this, you can imagine this old Oxford, I think even maybe the oldest Oxford college, kind of very historical building. Across the street, you have this old church, which still looks like an old church, but has some annexes built into it. And it's a church that is full 6 times, or at least 5 times during every Sunday. They start in the morning with services, and they have one, I think, every 2 hours. And the services look different and they feel different. The one that we walked into was the 6 o'clock service, which had contemporary music, which was accessible. They had a team of people in the front. They had a very skillful song leader who knew how to do enough to authentically draw people in, but not to overdo, which is a very difficult thing to put into words and convince you of unless you're there experientially. And they happened to have a baptismal service that time. And the baptismal service was for 3 young people, all of whom were students at the Oxford University, who had converted when they were there attending the university in Oxford. They also baptized by dipping them into the water. So they had a little pool in the corner. Didn't look anything fancy. It was like one of those things where you just put the plastic up and then you fill it in, and it was simple. They had all these 3 people come up and very briefly share what their journey with God has been like. There was no pretenses. The answers were brief, but ran deep. And then they just got baptized. And I felt like I was in the presence of God transforming lives. So there was nothing that I could describe to you that would tell you why it was such an impactful experience. It was about the felt depth and honesty in all of this. It's not about how it resonated. That's why I asked you kind of like, why would because the description doesn't give you the experience of the realization that God was there and that God was transforming lives and that this was one of the most beautiful baptismal services that I have ever attended. And that somehow these young people were visibly and tangibly giving their lives to God, genuinely, authentically, just as they are. And that this community was there genuinely rejoicing with them instead of measuring them. And it was just, yeah. It was the quality of it, not the shape and the form of it, I think.
All right. Thank you so much, Kärt. And thanks, Dr. Johnson, for that question. Ed Zerkwitz, time for you to join the conversation.
Yes, Mart, thank you very much for those very interesting aspects that you raised. And it would certainly be wonderful if many of those ideas were incorporated. I like what you said about some churches seem to hinder the experience of God. Some are neutral and some are very supportive. Our neighbor across the street from us invited my wife and I, to attend their Sunday church, and so we went. That was a few years ago, and I'll just tell you a little bit about the experience. So the pastor or the person, they had two pastors, one part-time. Anyways, the one that was preaching that day said they have devoted their focus to what was in Acts 2:42. And it says, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. This verse describes the first group of believers who continued to follow the apostles' teachings and fellowship after the day of Pentecost. The believers were devoted to the apostles' teachings and would not follow the teachings of others, especially those who manipulated the truth. The verse also mentions the breaking of bread and prayers, which are considered a form of worship and communion with God. The breaking of bread is also a time to remember Jesus, receive forgiveness of sins, and proclaim the Lord's death. So he talked about from what happened a year prior to when we arrived that day, and their church attendance, regular attendance, went from about 15 to 20 every Sunday to over 100 every Sunday. And all they did, or I shouldn't say all, I don't know what else they did, but their main focus was on those four aspects. And then he described how people really got fulfilled because of that focus, those four things. So I just wondered what your thoughts were around that.
I think you're absolutely right. It is actually quite simple. It is actually quite simple. It is not hard to do. It is extremely hard to do church well, but it is also actually not hard to do church well. And it is simply just coming together to break bread, to be there for each other, to keep your eyes on God and God's work for us. And it does not need any of the formal elements. Now, there are a variety of formal elements that can facilitate the engagement with those points. But it is possible to be a really good quality church without any production. And it is possible to do that in a small community, and then growth will happen naturally. So thank you for highlighting these things.
All right. Thank you so much, Ed, for sharing that. Lauren, it is just about 3:30. I know usually you'd want to share with persons what's coming up. Are you there? Okay.
I am indeed. Uh, our teacher next week is going to be one of our favorite teachers who returns quite frequently, and that is Dr. Reinder Brensma. And let me give me a little moment to look up. He just sent me a note saying what he's going to be teaching about, and I'll give that to you after the next person speaks.
All right, not a problem. Linda, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Okay, I will. Thank you. Kärt, and Ed, I'm resisting the urge to ramble, Ed Reifsnyder, like you did, but you'll find out in my remarks that actually I agree with you more than you think. Kärt, you have such a unique capability. You are such a brilliant intellectual, and yet somehow you have the ability to take that and put it into such a practical and real form that it's really quite impressive. I was afraid your presentation would be boring, but in fact it was just stunningly beautiful, and I'm touched deeply by it. But I have to say, having said that I feel like it's a beautiful Band-Aid on top of a pernicious boil. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You're probably too young to remember it back when I was in graduate school, years and years ago. There was a guy who named Marshall McLuhan, and he was actually considered the father of media studies. And he coined it a phrase which went like this: the medium is the message.
Yes.
Really, it had to do at that time with things that plugged into walls like TVs and radios, very different today. But in the context of your presentation, I would suggest that the church service is the medium for the message, which is really about who God is and who we are there to worship. And as you have pointed out, institutional Christianity writ large has distorted that picture of God for centuries. And so it raises, in fact, the quarterly, as one of several teachers in my adult Sabbath school class, we spend all of our trying to correct the misperceptions of God that comes out every quarter in this periodical. And in fact, the author this quarter in the first lesson has the temerity to ask, why do you think there's so many misunderstandings of God's character in our world today? Well, it's because the institutional church has done that to us historically. But if that's true, what is the point of a church service when we lack a clear picture of who we are worshiping? I mean, are the parishioners benefited by that? Is God benefited by that? There was that old saying, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody around to hear it, does it make a sound? And this almost feels like this to me. It's a little like practicing a bad golf swing. All that does is just build the wrong movements into your muscle memory. And so, like, I would use the term stakeholder as opposed to partners, as Ed has suggested. But fundamentally, wouldn't it make more sense for the stakeholders to get together and decide what the message really should be before we determine what the medium is?
Yes.
In a word.
Yes, next. Yes, definitely. I believe that is the thing. The inside out approach should be precisely that. You start digging from what the image of God is like. But there was this one element in that entire, it's a bit like getting into a circle, and it is not a circle, not like a vicious circle, but it is something, as I said, it expresses and it forms. It expresses and it forms. And I think that is the complication of that picture, because in our experiences of God in action, we also form our image of who God is. But in the way that our image of God is, we also see and we don't predetermine God, but we predetermine our own ability to be able to see and identify God. Based on our picture of who God is, sometimes we refuse to see God in places where we don't believe that God can operate because of our twisted picture of God, right? Which means that then the revelation becomes this circular thing. But also there's no good way out of that circle unless we intentionally again stretch, right? And I believe that there are congregations in these big narratives as well who have literally done that, who have cut down everything and refused to operate and just gone back to the basics and built up from there, and then seen how the form takes shape as a result of this kind of almost like a shedding of skin, theological.
It's like a detox.
It's like a detox,
Yes.
yeah. But there's also I believe that it is we have to put into that equation that also in that process of detox, we still need some form of coming together and some form of responding to who God is as a community. And there's no point in doing it individually, because individually we just end up reproducing a smaller scale of more particular pathologies. And as we come together, we do it on a grander scale. And it's more visible because the statistically relevant grand pathology is not my personal pathology, which is the gift, because then I can call it out, right? When we come together communally. So I think that there's this idea of this circle that is naturally, or the spiral that we are walking, and we just need to discern where it is the way that we can step onto that circle to start expanding it and holding that space for God's revelation to come through. But you're absolutely right. I think that the form can only be determined once we know who it is that we are serving, and once we also know who I am, who is the thing that is serving. So it's this dance of figuring it out. As long as we keep that space for that dance to happen, I think, as long as we don't determine the walls and go like, this is it for the rest of the time for everyone. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that. Florian, you just want to wrap up, and then I'll do a short prayer with Florian.
Yeah.
Oh.
I just wanted to let you know, Reinder is suggesting that what he wants to do for this next Sabbath, he said, I want to talk about what heaven will be like, or what the afterlife will be like. He says, I'm not sure I know, or does it matter? But he said, we are given some hints about it in Scripture, so let's talk about it. I thought it sounds kind of interesting. So Reinder is going to be on next week. He's going to talk about heaven.
Okay, thank you.
We've got a little bit of time left here.
Yeah.
If Kärt can stay with us for a little longer, we have a few more people coming on. So thank you so much, Kärt. It's been really, really, really interesting and challenging, actually.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not even sorry about that. I'm glad. I just wanted to say that I already put it out there in the chat, the link to the Andrews conference, and they're not paying me to advertise it or anything. There's no monetary gain anyway. But
We thought,
but it's just I'm coming to the United States, and I will be presenting, and Dihi, my husband, will also be presenting, and it will be related to this topic. So I thought it would be fitting to share.
Yeah, it's coming up in February, and we would be delighted to announce it also, since you and Tihi are both friends of Adventist Today. We'll announce it in Adventist Today to our audience too.
That's lovely. Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna move the conversation a little bit to the foyer. As we wrap up, we have 3 hands. Ray, Bobby, please join the conversation.
Well, this talk in many areas reinforced so many of my thoughts and ideas over time. And the word reset usually means you go back to the original condition and start over. Now, Ed Snyder brought up, we don't know what the original condition was today. We need to go back. So in order to reset, we've got to figure out what the original setting was all about. Because to me, I see much of what happens as a continuation of the ancient and, to use a word that people may not like, pagan concepts. the idea of God, God's worship, and all the things all go back to that period. We've never progressed. So reset has to mean, to me, going back and saying, okay, what are we resetting to? Because it may mean a totally different way of looking at it. And you've outlined that, I believe. I mean, your ideas and what you have presented, I can't find that being a part of our ancient past, at least to me. Maybe in your studies, you've seen periods, but I'm not old enough to see that. So I think we need to re-examine what reset is, and then we can really go forward. And your talk was fantastic. I can't say enough good about it. It's most stimulating and reinforcing to me, at least. Thank you.
I'm so glad. Thank you. This is actually a really good. You're picking on a really good bit, and I did not think that part through, by the way, which shame to me, because you're right. It does go back to the original, right? Reset to the original setting. Now, thinking along, I'm just thinking, I don't think I am proposing going back, because going back so that we would be able to discern the original intent and the original state of things would mean going back beyond the fall to the first chapter of Genesis. And that is a very, very, very minimal description of a whole richness of perfection that we have zero access to. Well, zero is, all we know is that it was there. And there are very few principles that were outlined earlier, also in one of the questions, that we can actually draw from there. But all of that richness is not, in that sense, accessible to us without the webs of significance through which we are trying to determine the underlying or overarching image of God and God's action towards humans. What I mean by that is that I don't think that the reset should be going back to something that once was, because we can't access that. I think reset is going back to the picture that we have of God that is to the best of our knowledge, that we have been able to distill from God manifesting through these different ages and through these different cultures and trying to make themselves meaningful to us in language and traditions and kind of symbols and signification patterns that have been relevant. I know that there is a lot of discussion about the idea of certain things being, certain things that we have taken over originally having been pagan, and there is a very good reason to go back and kind of revise and to revise which of these elements have come with a burden that is not, that shouldn't be a part of our legacy. But I find it fascinating how at the end of his life, Joshua was inviting people, with this long monologue that he had about the story of the people of Israel. And then at the end, he goes like, but my family and I, we will serve the Lord, right? But the entire narrative before that is about different gods that were still a part of their heritage. And he mentions the gods of from beyond the Euphrates, which actually means the heritage of Abraham and the tradition that he came with. Then mentions the Egyptian gods, which is the story of the slavery, but also the inculturation in Egypt. And then mentions the gods around them at that moment. And he still mentions that we are all living in an infrastructure that has been built by them. We are eating from the vineyards that is a pagan culture. We are living in houses that have been built by a pagan culture, and we take it all as a gift from God. But now, in all of this, we are not supposed to be burning down those vineyards or demolishing down those cities. We are supposed to be doing the hard labor of discerning which of these parts we need to cast out and which of these are adoptable, because they are the infrastructure, because they are the meaning-making systems, because they are, we are supposed to be able to kind of like, what's the word? Like unweave or kind of those little yarns that have functioned as this one big rope. And we're not supposed to demolish it all at once, but we're supposed to distill the elements that are usable and that have been given to us as a gift. And I think that it is important in all of these traditions to also acknowledge that all of this, there's nothing in our systems that isn't cultural, because even Jesus landed in the middle of the culture, landed as a member of a particular ethnicity into a certain region, landed in human skin, landed in the choices of binary biological sex, landed in a context that, because the whole point was incarnation and the possibility of being meaningful, of making sense to the people. And the only way we can make sense is if we are in that web of significance. So I think that type of distilling and figuring out is always important, and we can't do that. We can't even talk about God without then doing all of that work, because God is always underlying, but always manifesting in that culture. And the reset is a call to understand what is the God under that keeps manifesting through history like this. And then to see how is God manifesting now in our context in a way that is meaningful, useful, helpful, and inspired. That was a very long detour, but I thank you for that comment, because I'm not inviting us to go back in time. It's actually quite the opposite. I'm inviting us to go back to the roots, but looking at now, and it will look different.
All right. Thanks so much, Ray, for that question. Eduardo, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Okay, let me first post a little quote. Cars, can you see it?
Wait.
He posted it in the chat.
In the chat.
Yes.
The Father whose eye can discern the least taint of imperfection, looking into the inner sanctuary of the soul, speaking about Jesus, saw nothing but purity, excellence, divine loveliness. This is true worship. Remember the conversation at Jacob's well with Jesus?
Yes.
He said it doesn't matter the place, but I think it doesn't matter the music or whatever the worship might have, but it's the heart.
Yes.
And Jesus mentioned God is looking for these true worshipers to worship him. What do you think?
Yes. Amen. It is the heart. I also believe that there are certain conditions that can make it easier for the heart to be responsive in the right way, and conditions in which it's harder. And I just wish that we as a community of believers would be the former, not the latter.
All right. Thank you so much, Eduardo. Emmanuel, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, I was a proverbial kid in the candy store. I really enjoy your presentation because I didn't express myself the way you express yourself, but I was thinking about the same line. We need to think outside the box. And I would like to give you two short stories. I was on the internet once, watching a video. Don't ask me what the browser was talking about, but I remember two things. It said it's time for us to stop asking the question, why people don't come to my church, but ask the question, why people should come to my church. The second story I would like to share with you is a lady, professor of English, upstate New York. She wrote a book, Secret Thought of an Unlikely Convert. It's a beautiful book, Rosaria Butterfield. She is a lesbian living with a partner, and she wrote an article every week in the paper. And she said she has two boxes, one side of her desk. And she received a letter one day. She doesn't know where to put the letter. People will agree with her or people will disagree with her. After a couple of days, she said, let me call the person. It was a Presbyterian minister. The minister said, my wife and I will be delighted to have you to supper in our house. She went several times, not once they addressed her homosexuality. She went to church with them from her own volition. Not once a member in the church said something to them about their homosexuality. Now she's married with a Presbyterian minister, and she has a vibrant ministry here in the United States. She wrote about 4 books after the first one. And I asked myself, wait a minute. If the pastor was not a Presbyterian minister, it was a Seventh-day Adventist minister, what would have been the outcome? We are very rigid in our liturgy. What you say makes a lot of sense. I doubt this will be implemented in my church.
No, I am really sorry. I am really sorry that this might be the reality in very many places. And I don't believe that people are mean. I believe that people are afraid. And I wish that we knew how to help people not be afraid. Yeah, I think people are afraid. They are afraid of other people, but even more so ultimately, if we profess to be Christians, I believe that we are ultimately afraid of God. And we are afraid of what God will do to us if we get tainted, or if we misstep. Our assumptions about what the consequences of that will be do not really, if we dig deep from that angle, they do not really land in a concept of a God whom we truly believe to be good. It doesn't even land in a God that we believe that in the final reviewing of God's kind of the accusations raised against God, that God will be acquitted, you know. But our theology applied seems to be not actually in alignment with our theology declared.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for that insight. Doug, Teresa, you have the final question this afternoon.
Thank you. This was a fantastic presentation. It left me, I would say, speechless, but that wasn't true, because in the chat, I was the one that started the rather active conversation there for a bit.
It's a full novel there. I need to go and read it, because I was talking whilst you were having all the fun. So I need to go and read it.
I feel like the Dutch boy that pulled his finger out of the hole in the dike.
Whoops.
But I was also thinking that I struggled to put ATSS in context with what most of my prior life was prior to 5 years ago, when Teresa and I started attending, in quotes, ATSS, because I was pretty much in church and Sabbath school every Sabbath, and I've been in one church service since then, and the rest of it's been ATSS. And so I felt like I had to characterize this by saying, we just had a worship service about worship service. And for me, ATSS has been that in many respects. I also think about the term itself, as was alluded to earlier, and think about it in terms of an honorific, a title. And so we talk about Your Majesty. In the United States, we do have Your Honor. And there are places where we say Your Worship. I haven't ever done that, but it is a title for a person in some places and some cultures. And so that was a very salient thought about the sort of ancient history of what worship was about. And that was a very, very thought-provoking comment. And then about the issue of going back, resetting, my take on that was a little different. Resetting to original, define original, and in the context of what we know in DNA biology, and I'm far from professing that, we know that every single one of us earthlings is original. Our experience, not just our DNA, but our experience makes us each original. Even if we happen to be an identical twin, which I'm not, our experience is going to differ. And so in that context, I think everything you said about resetting is true, because what we're resetting to is the original in each of us. And I believe that Jesus taught that, and he taught it most powerfully by saying that we need to regard the least of these. And so I think that though I'm an adult white male, old, straight, cisgender, I think that for me to think about setting, resetting, and to an original, I need to think about the people that I am not. I am not female. I am not many other things. I am white. I'm a privileged person. And so in that context, I was born and raised in the US. I'm an American. And that is probably some of the problem that I would have in going back to an original, is that I believe Jesus was very clear that I need to think about those that were not like me, that are not like me, when I think about resetting. And we have failed as an institutional church to do that. First of all, by marginalizing 50% of the people in our church to begin with, and then marginalizing a whole lot more in addition to that. So that's where I struggle in trying to redefine resetting to the original in that the way the journey of our spiritual life has taken us. And I think that we can do much better as a church than what we have. And that's got to start with me. And that's got to start with trying to respectfully find out what it's like to live other people's lives. And to me, that's a good place to start. But thank you very much for a very powerful presentation.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you so much for this comment as well. It really nicely wrapped up the next steps, kind of. That was the sending part.